Tonight I'm going to talk about the argument I make in this new book, The End of America. And I'm just going to speak from my heart about what I see happening right now and what we need to do about it. And I kind of want to issue a bit of not a warning, but almost like like those rides you go on in Disneyland where, if they're very turbulent, you get a heads up. It's a very difficult message. In some ways, I'm going to take you on a difficult journey, but I want to reassure you that we're going to come out to sunshine and hope.
I began to ask this question, what is man? And I found, oddly enough, that nobody could tell me what man was. What did he consist of? Where was he going? What was he doing? I have studied 21 different primitive races, including the white race.
Not only were there tactical echoes from the past, but that what I was seeing was actual scenes recurring, imagery recurring, language, sound bites recurring.
They wore Hitler's uniforms, but they wrapped themselves in the American flag.
These images echoed in 21st century America.
He talks about those Greek rallies precisely as an expression of the magical structure of consciousness.
There has been, or there is, a covert narcissist in your life.
It's the American way. It's a land of milk and honey. And if you're just smart enough and motivated enough.
Welcome to church.
We will begin the session now. You will remain aware of everything that goes on.
Okay.
We're going to find an incident in your life you have an exact record of. Then, by sending you through it at the time it happened, we're going to reduce it. We will reduce the pain.
Like, I was in Scientology probably 4 months, and I had done more than John Travolta had done, and he'd been there for 85 years or some shit. My agents call, you got an audition, fuck it, I don't really, you know what I mean? I've always on about a spiritual adventure, and this was like, whoa, this is an interesting road, So, what was the question?
Why people believe one idea rather than another. I've studied Jonestown, radical Islam. They're oftentimes good-hearted people, idealistic, but full of a kind of crushing certainty that eliminates doubt. My goal wasn't to write an expose. It was simply to understand Scientology, trying to understand what people get out of it. Why do they go into it in the first place? I was interested in intelligent and skeptical people who are drawn into a belief system and wind up acting on those beliefs in ways they never thought they would.
These are the times we will all remember. Were you there? What did you do? So what do you say? We're going to clean this place up? Huh? Okay. Because we're counting on you. Okay? All right? To LRH.
Works. The first exercise after you do all this reading and stuff like that is this thing called OTTR0. which is basically you sit just like this, eyes closed, 3 feet away from somebody who's doing the same thing, and you basically confront them, you know? And in Scientology lingo, I went exterior. Exteriorizing is what they call it. You know, you leave your body. So it was a transcendent experience for me. And that made me go, holy fucking shit, this is, wow.
I was reading books in Scientology.
I began to ask this question, what is man? And I found, oddly enough, that nobody could tell me what man was. What did he consist of? Where was he going? What was he doing? To really know life, you've got to be part of life. You must get down and look. You must get into the nooks and crannies of existence. You have to rub elbows with all kinds and types of men before you can finally establish what he is.
And you, in fact, did this?
Yes, I've slept with bandits in Mongolia, and I've hunted with pygmies in the Philippines. As a matter of fact, I have studied 21 different primitive races, including the white race.
To understand Scientology, you have to understand the life and mind of its inventor, L. Ron Hubbard. Hubbard was a prolific writer. He actually holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the number of books published, more than 1,000. Hubbard got his start in the Depression, writing pulp fiction, named.
And a lot of what Scientology is, he had previously written about in the form of his science fiction. He had the ability to fabricate these amazing tales, and he transported those imaginary stories into his theology.
We are making such individuals, and we're making them regularly, and we're making them routinely.
He degenerated into a really paranoid, terrifying person.
It was very exciting. It was that heady mix of emotion and belief, and you get stuck to it. It's so strong that it sticks you like glue, and there's no way you can get away from it.
When he first got into Scientology, he didn't even believe in himself that much, but he got injected with a lot of confidence, and then you get this phobia inducement that if I leave, it's all gonna go down the tubes. When you're in the organization, all the good that happens to you is because of Scientology, and everything that isn't good is your fault.
They sell it all in the beginning as something quite logical. Everything makes sense. And you're going up what they call the bridge, and you're doing this auditing, and this is good. And the next one, well, it's not quite as good. It didn't quite make sense to you, but you know, you've already paid for the next one, so you'll do that one.
The bridge, it's a metaphor. You start here at the bottom of the bridge, and then you go to the top. So where it is, and it's an awareness scale. You start down here and you're not aware of anything, and then you go up here and you're a lot more aware of who you are, your spirituality, your relationship to others. A person is supposed to become more able as they go up the bridge. And then there are the OT levels, operating Thetan, and a Thetan is a spiritual being. That's the soul of the person.
And what level over time did you achieve?
OT 8. That's the highest there is. You can't get any higher than OT 8.
From the beginning, you hear these stories people tell of these abilities they've been able to gain.
It was always talked about that people who are OT could read your mind, and they could move objects at will, and they could, you know, they were cause over matter, energy, space, and time. So it sounded damn good to me. I mean, I thought, wow, this is great.
I finally get to OT3, and they give me the secret materials, which you've been hearing about all this time. They're handwritten by Hubbard. You have to keep them in a locked briefcase. be very cautious, because they've always said if this gets out, it's dangerous to people. It can actually do them harm if they are not adequately prepared. And I read it. And it doesn't make any sense.
This garbled story that didn't make sense.
I think, remember, for one fleeting second, thinking, well, maybe it's an insanity test. Maybe if you believe this, they kick you out. Maybe that's it. That, of course, is not the case. They talk about, the fact that the Earth was created and such trillions of years ago, and this guy, space guy.
Galactic overlord. This was the prison planet, and people being caught and captured and being brought to planet Earth.
And put them in volcanoes and then blow them up with A-bombs.
Whoa. I studied geography in school. Those volcanoes didn't exist 75 million years ago.
And we have these lost souls all over us, and we have to get rid of them. And I'm going, what? The fuck are you talking about? I'm down for the self-help stuff. I'm down for, okay, I can be clear. I can, I can get rid of the negative emotions. But what the fuck is this?
I think that his whole creation of Scientology really was a form of self-therapy. If he was just a fraud, then at some point he would have taken the money and run, but he never did that. He spent much of his day on the e-meter trying to understand what was going on inside his own mind.
Hubbard became increasingly paranoid that a powerful Thetan had infected his body and that regular auditing wasn't strong enough to make it leave. When Larry Wright was researching his book, he videotaped an interview with a Scientologist who was asked to help Hubbard expel the Thetan.
He was having problems getting rid of a BT, body Thetan. So he wanted me to build a machine and basically blow the Thetan away. Just get him out of there, blow him out. And also kill the body.
It was a suicide mission.
Basically, yeah.
Scientology really is a journey into the mind of L. Ron Hubbard. And the further you get into it, the more like L. Ron Hubbard you become.
Hubbard died of a stroke in 1986, but he left no plan for succession. The ambitious David Miscavige stepped forward, and by bending arms and making deals, took control of the church and installed a new generation of lieutenants.
We want to make sure that all of us end cycle on this completely, so we can get on with the job that is ahead of us.
The first time I met Miscavige was in '83. He was a guy running back and forth between Hubbard and the property in Hemet in a van, back and forth, delivering messages. Worked my way through the organization, and Miscavige would come down to Florida, where I was running the place, and we slowly but surely became friends. By 2001, I was working directly for Miscavige. We'd sit and drink a bottle of scotch, and I'd hear everything he had to say about the church and about the people involved from his perspective. And honestly, it was horrifying. It was scary.
They were breaking into offices, framing people. This is the activities of a church?
There was a guy who, was a reporter for the LA Times whose dog was poisoned while he was working on a Scientology story.
Again and again, while reporting this story, we met many former members who described Scientology as a dangerous and deeply paranoid organization.
They hire private detectives to harass people. I have been sued twice. Financial ruin.
Years of harassment.
Their homes broken into, have them beaten.
We chased her around, we followed her to the airport.
Gotten hold of personal phone records.
Slash their tires, break their car windows.
I was locked in a chicken wire cage.
Dangerous, horrifying, terrifying fraud. A nightmare.
Many of their stories are corroborated in sworn court testimony by up to a dozen other people. Are they all lying?
They sat in a room. They figured out what they were going to say.
My position as the spokesperson was to evade the question or sleaze around some way or give what was an acceptable answer or something that I believed at the time.
Please welcome Mr. Mike Rinder.
Because Scientology is perceived and conceived by Scientologists as being the salvation for mankind, You can have people that lie with a very straight face if they believe that what they are doing is protecting the Church of Scientology.
L. Ron Hubbard says, we do not find critics of Scientology who do not have criminal pasts. Do you believe that?
Sure.
People who oppose you are undoubtedly criminals?
I believe that, yeah. You know, there isn't and hasn't been any effort which has been taken to, quote, silence critics.
No, that doesn't happen. Oh, we would never do that.
But according to many insiders, Hubbard was growing more and more vindictive toward those who stood in his way. He created what he called the Rehabilitation Project Force.
The RPF was what we called it. It was the prison camp where you'd go for reindoctrination. Those words were such a wake-up call for me. And I went over there to the cadet org. There were so many sick children in there, and my daughter was very, very ill, burning up with fever, completely neglected, in a urine-soaked crib. Her eyes were so filled with mucus, they were welded shut. She had fruit flies on her body, and I couldn't bear it. I just went, no, I'm done. I mean, I just knew I could make these choices for me. I could decide to give up my life and do this to help the world, but I couldn't make these choices for my children. I just had to get her out. I'm thinking, I'm a dead person. Something terrible is going to happen to me. I was just so frightened that they would come to fetch me up.
One of the turning points in Travolta's relationship with the church is when he understood what was happening to Spanky. He didn't do anything about it.
I know that he certainly got exposed to the fact that not everything was on the up and up. Why that wasn't sufficient for him to leave, I don't know. I often wonder what could possibly keep him there.
There's a particular writing where Hubbard is training these Office of Special Affairs people on how when you use private information to control somebody to do what you want them to do and to silence them from speaking out against Scientology, it's really not blackmail because you're not asking for money, but you're holding the secret information over the person's head to silence them.
Welcome to church.
It was the biggest event in Scientology history. And of course, Miscavige wanted to milk it for everything he had. It's this grand produced thing where it's all the single person on a gigantic stage, all this sort of Nazi symbolism. I clearly recall getting prepared for the event and Miscavige up in that office, you know, going 18, 20 hours a day writing this speech and thinking to myself, my God, you know, this is not just a victory celebration. This is a coup.
And I quote, "You are a Scientologist. You are a mindless robot." Well, those who know me can imagine my response. It was short, but certainly made the point.
Following our greatest triumph over fourth dynamic suppression, it is time to reach out and create a new era of expansion.
It's a crime that we've given them religious recognition and that they can hide behind it. Meanwhile, you got very good people in there. Their lives are being destroyed.
Nicole, her biggest beef was that Tom was becoming increasingly like Dave. She really got him to drift away from the church, and Tom was not really actively involved in Scientology between 92-ish all the way up till 2001.
They were away for more than a year shooting Eyes Wide Shut in the UK, and Cruz was not in touch with Miscavige, and this drove Miscavige crazy.
Miscavige was brilliant at flaming people's fears and building up their egos.
And I went, you know, they said, so, like, have you met an SP? And I looked at him, you know, and I thought, oh, what a beautiful thing, because maybe one day it'll be like that. You know what I'm saying? Maybe one day it will be that. Wow, SPs, like, they'll just read about those in the history books, you know?
All Scientologists are full of shit. You know, they lie. Oh, I'm doing great, you gotta get on 7. You know, and they're fucking, I got a fucking migraine right now. And I've never felt so shitty. You know, that's the fucking life.
I want to tell you something. That I have never met a more competent, a more intelligent, a more tolerant, a more compassionate being outside of what I've experienced from LRH. And I've met the leaders of leaders. Okay? I've met them all. So I say to you, Sir COB, we are lucky to have you, and thank you very much.
You were in such a mental state that you're very controllable, very suggestible. We were told we needed to come up with what each other's crimes were against Miscavige and Hubbard so that we could eventually get out of the hole.
Scientology is really good at making you think that you're a scoundrel.
Confess your crimes, confess your crimes. What have you done?
Fights would break out. Miscavige would get me all riled up, and I remember one time Mike had done something or not done something, I don't remember, and I was supposed to go beat him up.
One executive was made to mop up the bathroom floor with his tongue. Another was put into a bucket and pummeled by some of the women and called a lesbian.
There was a very powerful air conditioner which blew straight down, and it was set on maximum cold, and a guy was made to sit in a chair and had water poured on his head until he literally turned blue.
Miscavige slapped me across the face, knocked me on the ground, kicked me a couple times.
Flailing fists, kneeing him in the stomach, getting him on the floor.
And you think you want to get up and retaliate. But you also think, I got 75 other people who are all likely to tackle me if I did. And then you get the sheer shock of it. Here's the equivalent of the Pope suddenly knocking you on the ground, and you're thinking, I must have really screwed up.
I read all of your affidavits. Obviously, your ex-husbands have made charges against David Miscavige, saying that they have seen repeated acts of physical violence perpetrated by Mr. Miscavige. Is any of that true?
No. Not one ounce of it. That's not the character of Mr. David Miscavige.
My ex-wife, Marty Rathbun's ex-wife, Tom DeVocht's ex-wife, that were on Anderson Cooper, they all came out of the hole. They were all sent there to do that. They went back to the hole. It's just ridiculous. This line that my ex-wife said,
I lived with Mike Rinder for over 35 years. I know every square inch of Mike Rinder's body.
She said it because she was told to say it by Miscavige. And the proof of that is when Tom DeVocht's ex-wife then repeated the same thing over again.
I knew every inch of him.
You gotta be kidding me.
Everything that happens from the Church of Scientology is scripted.
Okay, there we are.
He's got his camera and he's standing there and he's saying, I want a response. I have credible witnesses. Did David Miscavige physically assault you? And I said,
those allegations are absolute, utter rubbish. Absolute, utter rubbish.
You have been assaulted by Miscavige.
Many times. Many times. Perhaps more than anybody else. I was now sort of at the end of my rope. It was a real moment of clarity for me. I don't want to be doing this anymore. This is nuts. That was actually the last thing that I did before I left. It really is the crux of how controlling is any religion over its adherents. And Scientology has perfected a lot of techniques of control.
You take on a kind of a matrix of thought that is not your own.
Where are the checks and balances on his power? There is none.
The church now no longer has a public face.
ABC News has repeatedly requested interviews with Mr. Hubbard. We have been told that he is unavailable.
Welcome to my latest video blog. Today we are going to be talking about narcissism. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for watching. Often people ask me, what is a narcissist? That's a tricky and sometimes complicated question to answer, because narcissism is really a general personality trait. You can have healthy narcissism, or you can have pathological narcissism. For example, like narcissistic personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder, or antisocial personality disorder. Healthy narcissism could be seen in a 20-year-old who just got his first job and is putting a Facebook status and wants to tell everyone. But there is pathological narcissism. And the difference between healthy and pathological narcissism is people get hurt with pathological narcissism. It's a psychological disorder in which you focus or over-focus on your own needs while ignoring, diminishing, or marginalizing the needs of others. Is narcissistic personality disorder or the other pathological narcissistic disorders curable? Sadly, not often. And the reason for this is you need to know what's wrong with you in order to get help. And think about it, it's that simple. If you can't see what's wrong with you, if you can't reflect on your faults or those parts of your personality that need help or work, it's almost impossible to make progress in psychotherapy. Narcissists that do start in these programs sometimes will drop out because someone in the program, say their therapist, challenged them. And they experienced a narcissistic injury, and that was the end of that therapy. A lot of therapists know this when giving marital therapy with someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, because when you hold a narcissist accountable in that therapeutic environment, often the narcissist is insulted. They are horrified that you would even allude to or insist that maybe it's part of their problem. And because of this personality disorder, they not only deny it, but they push back and they say, it is your problem, you're a bad therapist, and that's the last time you saw them. Does our culture celebrate narcissism? Absolutely. Our culture is about achievement. It's the American way. It's a land of milk and honey, that if you're just smart enough and motivated enough, you can achieve whatever you put your heart and mind to. Does narcissism get worse over time? It's my experience that it absolutely does. Remember, narcissists are psychologically damaged individuals. I know that's a very, very strong term to use for a human being, but psychologically they suffered so much trauma as a child that their psychological development was stunted, and they never grew in a way that most people grow in order to have healthy, loving, mutual and reciprocal relationships. So how do you spot a narcissist when they're so charming and likable and talented? The best answer I have for that is healthy individuals have what I call a narcissist barometer. In other words, if you are not a codependent and someone who is narcissistic or has a narcissistic personality disorder behaves in the way that we understand narcissists do, something's going to go off, it's going to feel wrong. And we call that, gut feeling, intuition. The charm will wear thin. Whether it's in the same day, it's a week, it's 3 months, or 6 months. The narcissist can only hold it together and pretend they are greater than they think they are. Because we know at the core of the narcissist is a broken, shame-based person with very low self-esteem. and eventually that's going to come out. Is it possible to have healthy boundaries with a narcissist? Or another version of that question is, how do you set boundaries with narcissists? First, and the most easy part of this question is no, it's not possible to have healthy boundaries with a narcissist, because a narcissist wants so much more than anyone can give. They want who you are and what you like and what you need. They want to suck the life out of you in order to fulfill this bottomless, insatiable desire to be front and center and get all the attention. Welcome to my latest video blog. Today I'm going to talk about covert narcissists again. There's no coincidence that that video was one of my most viewed videos. There is something about covert narcissism and how upsetting it is for those who learn about it for the first time. But more than that is to realize that there has been, or there is, a covert narcissist in your life. They are the worst type of narcissist, the absolute worst. Think about it. Covert narcissists thrive by pretending to be something they are not. Altruistic, kind, empathetic, connected. They pretend to be codependents. And as I explained in detail in my YouTube video on covert narcissism, they get what they need out of life by creating this false self, this facade that gets them the money, the respect, but all at the same time, they're in these relationships where they're hurting people and behaving pathologically narcissistic behind the scenes. But what I want to talk about today is what to do when you find yourself in a relationship with a covert narcissist. It is most of all, first and foremost, disturbing, because you have bought into the image, the persona of the kind, benevolent, giving person. And don't we all want to believe that the person who we're in a friendship with, the person who's our therapist, our rabbi, our doctor, our husband, wife, don't we want to believe that the kindness is true? That they really care about us and that the empathy is not BS? They thrive on being able to fool. They thrive on being able to deceive. Not because they're sociopaths or liars, but because they can't get what they want if the world knows who they really are. The second thing I recommend is to calm down. When you uncover the covert narcissist's real motives and you finally understand that what you see is not what really is, if you uncover it and you bring it to light, especially in public, they have everything to gain by making you look bad, making you look irrational, by making you look mentally ill, or just to intimidate you and berate you until you actually recoil and admit to them that you were wrong. So let me repeat it, is to not call them out, especially in public, because there is too much at stake for them to lose that audience, that group of people, that job that supply them not only their narcissistic riches or narcissistic rewards, but sometimes their job. The third piece of advice: once you discover that your loved one or someone with whom you are in a relationship that is a covert narcissist, you're not going to call them out. You are going to decide on a way to exit the relationship, a way to terminate the relationship without an obvious confrontation. Come up with an exit plan. Make this exit plan carefully thought through and carefully executed. The next step is to understand how passive-aggressive covert narcissists are. And I cannot say this more, I cannot emphasize this enough. When you find out that someone is a covert narcissist, you uncover them, they're probably going to find out because, you know, we're human. As I say, you're probably not going to win if you take them on directly, because they're smart enough, manipulative enough, and they have legions of followers who believe in this image of perfection and kindness and love. Their passive-aggressive ways will be able to take all of their followers and all of the people that drink their covert narcissist Kool-Aid, and they will be able to get them to understand what is wrong with you. In a way, we call this projection. You, the threat, who knows exactly who they really are, who can expose them, who calls them out, they have everything to gain by making you look bad. And because they're covert narcissists, they don't do anything direct. There's no direct aggression, there's no direct confrontation. It's passive-aggressive reactions. The retaliation is manipulative, sometimes hidden in what seems obviously kind, benevolent, and even appreciative actions. The last thing I want to say about how to deal with covert narcissists is to understand the degree of danger involved. I know personally that every time I've called out a covert narcissist, and I think of a famous YouTube person, I think of a psychologist, a therapist, I think of a boss, I think of a friend, and it has always been a difficult, uphill battle to not only survive, but to get out of it unscathed. Do not take on a covert narcissist directly. Identify their covert narcissism, come up with an exit plan, initiate it or execute it quietly without a lot of confrontation, be prepared for the battle.
Today's video, the narcissist mimicking you is real and could be seriously deep. Topics of discussion. The method behind the narcissist mimicking others. Narcissists are clever with the art of the copycat. Last topic, tools, references, and resources of which you can find in the description box below. First point, in the eyes of the narcissist, no one can outshine him or her, nor are they supposed to. In order to ensure that his or her false self-image is thriving, the narcissist might begin mimicking those that supply them. However, those that the narcissist might be feeling threatened or challenged by, he or she might use several diabolical tactics in order to mimic their targeted prey. Okay, so the narcissist and the cluster B personality, they are never one who runs out of diabolical tactics, nor do they run out of shenanigans that they pull off a narcissistic supply. So they usually have a big old trick bag of abracadabras. Okay, they never run out of ways to try to obtain narcissistic supply from other people. So when it comes to their false self-image, or really their false self-images, they usually view others that are threatening and challenging their false self-images as people who stand up to him or her. So if you're a person who stands up to the narcissist and cluster B personality, now when I say stand up to, I don't mean confronting as to goat them into an argument. In other words, you're turning the tables, okay? Narcissists and cluster B personalities, they're very good at goading other people into arguments, all for the fuel and the control and the narcissistic supply. However, when you stand up to him or her, this does not necessarily mean that you're flipping that around and you're giving them a taste of their own medicine. That's usually not a good idea, because a lot of narcissists and cluster B personalities, they are ultra sensitive. You know, they have an inflated ego. They usually take everything, anything and everything very personally. Then before you know it, you'll have a person who is experiencing a meltdown right in front of you. They may actually be breaking down. They may actually be expressing their anger through narcissistic rage and claiming narcissistic injury. So we really don't want that, right? Okay, because that can get ugly very quickly. Narcissists and cluster personalities, when they perceive others challenging them, when they perceive threats, it's usually not reflected upon the reality. So it's really in the mind of the narcissist. Sometimes it isn't, but sometimes it is. So in the eyes of the narcissist, no one is to outshine him or her, nor are they supposed to. A lot of narcissists and cluster B personalities have a superiority complex. They think that they are way above and beyond everyone. Okay, so they usually perceive threats and slights and challenges to their false self-images very often. So this is when they really get busy on digging in and trying to come up with as many shenanigans as possible, as well as engaging in many diabolical tactics in order to mimic their target prey. So how do they mimic the targeted prey? Well, let's go to the next point. Due to the narcissist's insecurities, loyalty to the survival of their false self-images, and a strong sense of entitlement, he or she might make a feeble attempt to do the impossible. That is, to become a better version of the targeted prey or master the art of the copycat. The narcissist in your life might be like a parasite and a predator rolled up into one. Okay, so this is how the narcissist mimics other people. They study them. Okay, they try to become a better version of another person, okay, or the person that they're targeting. So in other words, they master the art of the copycat. And many times those diabolical tactics are very subtle. You know, you may think you're dealing with the narcissist and the cluster personality who has convinced you that they are a loving and caring person. Yet, really, what they're doing is they are mimicking you. You may have some very appealing traits about yourself. Remember, the narcissist is studying you. Every gesture, the way that you express yourself. What also makes the narcissist mimicking others very subtle is that a lot of people who are involved with him or her, and this could be a romantic situation or not. Many people who are in a dysfunctional relationship with the narcissist, they don't realize that the narcissist is mimicking him or her because they study their gestures. They play them back to the targeted prey. So for instance, you may have a particular cute way that you may get when you become angry. You've heard that expression, you're so cute when you're mad, right? You're so cute when you're angry. So the narcissist and cluster B personality, they may pick up on this, your cute ways, right? When you get angry, they're studying you. So they mimic it. They gesture that back to you. They play that gesture back to you. There may be a particular way that you use your hands when you speak. The narcissist is studying that. So they will do the same thing. Okay, so they want you to feel very comfortable with him or her. They want you to feel like they are trustworthy. This is exactly why narcissists and cluster B personalities mimicking others can be very subtle. Because after they study the targeted prey, they usually play their gestures back to them, or they copy their gestures. The way that they experience, or pardon me, the way that they express their emotions is copied and it is played back to the targeted prey. The narcissist and cluster B personality, they can become a master at the art of the copycat by doing this. The narcissist in your life might be like a parasite and a predator rolled up into one. Okay, they may be like a predacite. Okay, yes, that's a word I just made up, but yeah, it's like they are a predacite. They're a predator and they're a parasite all at the same time. I know most of you have heard about these psychic vampires, the energy vampires, that some have claimed that narcissists in their lives are like. Some people who have described the cluster B personalities in their lives, you know, as one who is like a psychic or a energy vampire. Now, a lot of us have heard this, okay? So the narcissist, yes, they can be like a predacite, a person who's a predator and a parasite all rolled into one, and also like that vampire who comes to suck your energy right out of you or drain your energy. And let's move forward. One of the things that predators do is study the targeted prey that is being hunted. Prior to ensnaring or capturing the targeted prey, the predator must have a trap that is very enticing to the targeted prey. Narcissists mimic others in order to appeal to him or her. Narcissists often attempt to know the dark secrets of others, their pain, and his or her vices. So narcissists and cluster B personalities, like that of a predator, okay, they study the targeted prey. So they want to know what your vices are. They want to know what your weaknesses are. What are those deep, dark, dirty secrets that you're keeping from him or her? Like a vampire, they're ready to sink their teeth in. So the narcissist and the cluster B personality, they put a lot of time and energy into attempting to know the deep, dark, dirty secrets of others, their pain and their vices. So please beware of this. This is exactly why they may seem like to be that of a psychic. The narcissist and the cluster B personality to some may seem as if he or she has a sixth sense, or they are like a person who is a psychic and they know exactly what to say, when to say it, and how. They also know what to do, when to do it, and how. Again, the narcissist, like a predator, they study the targeted prey. It's not that they have these magical superpowers. It's just that, like a predator, the narcissist and the cluster B personality, they're masters at mimicking, copying, if not hijacking, the identities of others, all for the narcissistic supply. Next point. By mimicking you and your appealing characteristics or traits, the narcissist can influence or manipulate you into feeling and thinking that you are dealing with a person that is trustworthy, loving, caring, and honest, when in fact, you are dealing with a narcissist who imitates you. The narcissist has mastered the art of the copycat. So like I stated in the previous slides, the narcissist and the cluster B personality, they master the art of the copycat. They mimic other people by studying them. Okay, so the narcissist and the cluster B personality, they may come off like a person who's trustworthy, who's honest, who's caring, who's loving, who may even be very friendly. And dare I say, they may seem like they're heaven sent. Okay, this is all because they have mimicked you. They have studied you. So when you're dealing with the narcissist and cluster B personality, they are influencing, if not manipulating you into thinking and feeling that they have these characteristics, when in fact, they're gesturing you, they're imitating you, they're playing back your appealing characteristics. Yeah, I think that's a little eerie, but when you think about it, some of you have already experienced this. I know I have.
Here's another gift. It's not from me. It's from a client. When I was talking to him, he said to me, "Do you know what question you're supposed to ask that supposedly reveals a narcissist?" And I said, "No. I have my little test for revealing narcissists, but I don't know what question you're supposed to ask." And he said, "Well, this is Trev." Hello, Trev. He said he'd done some research and he'd found this question. The question is, in what ways do you think you need to grow or change? And the idea behind that question is, if you actually say, if you want to test a narcissist and you say to them, in what ways do you think you need to grow or change? It's a really clever question, because a true narcissist does not believe they need to grow or change at all. The reason why a true narcissist believes they don't need to grow or change at all is because they fundamentally believe that they're perfect. So if they are a true narcissist, this question will get a very bewildered response and possibly rage, possibly real anger, because of the implication that they are anything less than perfect. Some other tests that I formulated, I spoke in another video about doing tapping over a particular girl that I was dating, that I'd managed to find another narcissist, and I started to test her based on certain ideas I'd had through watching Blade Runner and Good Will Hunting. See, that's what kind of psychologist I am. Most people do it off research papers and proper experiments with white lab coats, and here I am doing it off films. So the film Blade Runner, which is like the Philip K. Dick book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? in order to find the androids that live among us, because we created, in this dystopian reality, we created androids, replicants. They're called replicants, to do the jobs that humans don't want to do, but we made them too well. And the slogan of the company that produces the androids is more human than human. So it's really hard to tell if they're human or not, but they are replicants, they're androids, they're not real people. So they do something called a Voight-Kampff test. The Voight-Kampff test is a test for empathy, it's a test for compassion. So I imagine that your man, Philip K. Dick, who was a very smart chap, was probably trying to give us a message at the time. Probably in his time, people weren't talking about narcissists too much, but they would have been talking about psychopaths. And basically, if you watch the film, you'll see what happens if you confront a replicant with this test, where you ask them questions of empathy and compassion for the suffering of others, or if you ask them to talk about their parents, because obviously they don't really have any parents. They only have the artificial memories of who their parents are pretending to be, that have been artificially installed.
Along in the sand when all of a sudden... Is this the test now? Yes. You're in a desert walking along in the sand when all of a sudden you look down.
What one?
What?
What desert?
Doesn't make any difference what desert. Is completely hypothetical.
But how come I'd be there?
Maybe you're fed up. Maybe you want to be by yourself. Who knows? You look down and you see a tortoise, Leon. It's crawling towards you.
Tortoise? What's that?
You know what a turtle is?
Of course.
Same thing.
Never seen a turtle. But I understand what you mean.
You reach down, you flip the tortoise over on its back, Leon.
Do you make up these questions, Mr. Holden? Or do they write them down for you?
The tortoise lays on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't. Not without your help. But you're not helping.
What do you mean I'm not helping?
I mean you're not helping. Why is that, Leon? They're just questions, Leon. In answer to your query, they're written down for me. It's a test designed to provoke an emotional response. Shall we continue? Describe in single words only the good things that come into your mind. About your mother?
My mother?
Yeah.
Let me tell you about my mother.
Watched Blade Runner, and after about 15 minutes she switched it off. She said it was boring, and I was like, well, that is remarkable. It's one of the best films. It's like Ridley Scott's greatest work, but she found it boring. So then I said, okay, let's watch another film called Good Will Hunting. And she watched it. She didn't find it as boring, but she said afterwards, I don't know what the point of the film is. And I was like, well, that is alongside, I mean, for some people they might just find it boring. There's a lot of talk in that film, I guess. To me, it's one of the best films ever made, but it's the ultimate film of empathy, because the oxygen that the film breathes, the capital that the film moves on, is compassion and empathy. And if you're not interested in compassion, you're not interested in empathy, you're not interested in being human and accepting humanness, the film will be meaningless to you. What the major emotional peak of the film, not that I want to give any spoilers to anybody who hasn't watched it, is the therapist telling the Matt Damon character that it's not your fault. And I find that a really, really moving scene every single time. I find it incredibly moving because of my own experiences and my own work doing therapy with people. And I asked this particular individual about what she thought about that scene, and she said, yeah, I didn't really get it. I didn't know, like, who had fault? Like, what was his fault for? Why would he feel guilty for being abused? And I was like, I can't even... There's so much that you would have to understand about real human emotion behind that question that I'd have to give you a 3-hour lecture that I know you'd fall asleep in after the first 5 minutes. So let's just give up.
My name is Sam Baknin, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. What happens when the narcissist fails to secure or to obtain sufficient narcissistic supply? Well, the narcissist then reacts very much as a drug addict would react to the absence of his or her particular drug of choice. You see, the narcissist constantly consumes, or one could say preys upon, adoration, admiration, approval, applause, attention, and other forms of narcissistic supply. When lacking or deficient, the narcissistic's deficiency dysphoria sets in, kind of depression. The narcissist then appears to be down, depressed. His movements slow down. His sleep patterns are disordered. He either sleeps too much or becomes insomniac. His eating patterns change. He begins to gorge on food or avoids it altogether. When narcissistic supply is insufficient or deficient, the narcissist is constantly dysphoric. He is sad. He is unhedonic. He finds no pleasure in anything, including his former pursuits, hobbies, and interests. He is subjected to violent mood swings, mainly rage attacks. The narcissist may compulsively or ritually resort to an alternative addiction: alcohol, drugs, reckless driving, pathological gambling, or showpuppilism. These are all substitutes for love and substitutes for narcissistic supply. And this gradual disintegration is the narcissist's futile effort, both to escape his predicament, the lack of narcissistic supply, and to sublimate his aggressive urges. His whole behavior seems constrained, artificial, and effortful. The narcissist gradually turns more and more mechanical, robotic, detached, and unreal.
What is the difference between a sociopath, a psychopath, and a narcissist? Here to answer this intense question is Dr. Ramani. Help us out here.
Well, it's, again, there's a lot of overlap, but the fact is a lot of people are using these terms interchangeably.
And should they be?
Sociopath, they psychopath. No, they shouldn't. They're different things, okay? One rule of thumb to remember right off the bat: every psychopath is narcissistic, but not every narcissist is psychopathic. So a psychopath, in fact, we know in the research on psychopathy, which has also been called antisocial personality disorder in our diagnostic manual, these are people who are actually believed to have slightly different autonomic nervous systems. Our autonomic nervous system is actually that part that holds our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight and flight system. So when our autonomic nervous system for a normal person gets charged up, which it would if we broke a rule, if we did something embarrassing or rude, if we ran through a red light, our heart starts racing. We sweat, our pupils get wide, we look around because we're afraid of the consequence. A psychopath doesn't have that same kind of arousal. That's why they're able to lie on lie detector tests. That's how they get away with it. They don't have that same kind of arousal. So where you or I may go on a roller coaster, feel that sense of excitement, we need to get that arousal in a good way. We don't like feeling it when we do something wrong. They don't feel it.
So do they get stressed?
No, not in the same way.
So if they're driving, because if I'm driving and I see police sirens coming behind me, I mean, it is a full-on, my gosh, I can't believe I'm going to get pulled over. But a psychopath would see that and go, oh, I'm going to get pulled over.
Well, this could be. They could have a dead body in the trunk and they wouldn't change.
And so they pull over, they get the ticket, and they don't care.
No, they don't care.
And they pay the ticket?
And maybe not. They'll even probably get an attorney to get them off or say, yeah, my understanding of your state laws is you can't really be doing this. And they'll be cool as can be.
And this is a difference in their
They're actually
their
how
makeup.
their nervous systems are wired and their brains are. There's actually been interesting research done with PET scans where you can see brain function and what
Not just a clarification, not PET like dogs and cats, PET scans.
Positron emission tomography scans of the brain, which show brain functioning, if you will. And what they see is that the section of the brain that serves empathy, that doesn't naturally light up in them. And you can actually teach them to be empathic for a minute, but it doesn't last. A lot of psychopaths who commit violent crimes end up in jail, and the ones who commit more like white-collar crimes, I guess they end up as multi-billionaires because they're willing to do really, really rough stuff in their business and get through like a cartel leader or something like that. Call for the killings of other people. Now, Sociopathy, they look a lot like the psychopaths. The difference is they were made. So some examples here. The kid who grows up in a really rough neighborhood and learns criminality to get by, or learns to be a bully, or gets involved with sort of like the wrong kids and uses a lot of muscle because that's survivalism, but it's not necessarily always comfortable for them. They just learn it. It's the person who grows up with a father who teaches them the business and teaches them how to break the rules. Would they start sweating and have their heart race if they got pulled over? They might. They may not feel so good about it. They'll be a little bit more uncomfortable with it, but in time they learn it. And it's almost like they get trained in not being as aroused by it. Listen, if you broke enough rules, if you lived under certain conditions of lawlessness long enough, you'd adjust to that new world order, if you will. That's what the sociopath does. And so they're the person who someone who said he was actually a great kid until he got to high school. And then it seems like he got in with the wrong kids. That feels more like the sociopath. Wow. Okay, that's almost like a training that might happen from within the family, within their community, within even the job they get, some cases even within some form of military training. Psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists make great chameleons because they understand a person. They can read a person and immediately say, I got his vulnerability. I'm going to make him buy a car. Psychopaths are great salesmen.
If a psychopath goes to jail, he isn't upset about going to jail?
In some ways, it becomes a cost of doing business.
If you find yourself dating a sociopath or a psychopath, is there any coping, or you just got to get out?
You're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
It could actually be very dangerous. They will dispose of you if you get in their way.
I want to share a story with you to get your feedback. This was told to me by a friend, and she said in college she dated a guy for a year, but the guy started to get just a little weird and they broke up. For the next year, he courted her and did everything she wished he had done the first year. Showed up on time, brought her gifts, blah, blah, blah. They started dating again. He was perfect for a year. They went to Thanksgiving at her family's house. He was perfect to her parents. Just became the perfect man for her because he knew what she wanted. And after a year, on the 1-year anniversary, he broke up with her and said, I've been playing you this whole time because I wanted to crush your heart. I am not actually behaving this way, or this isn't real. I've been faking it for a year just so I can crush you. Would that be
That's more psychopathic. That's more psychopathic.
Tonight I'm going to talk about the argument I make in this new book, The End of America. And I'm just going to speak from my heart about what I see happening right now and what we need to do about it. And I kind of want to issue a bit of not a warning, but almost like like those rides you go on in Disneyland where, if they're very turbulent, you get a heads up. It's a very difficult message. In some ways, I'm going to take you on a difficult journey, but I want to reassure you that we're going to come out to sunshine and hope. If not sunshine, certainly hope on the other side. So the book, this is why I wrote the book. I wrote the book for an older person and for a younger person in my life. The older person is a mentor of mine who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And we would sit around chatting about news events. And she kept saying, they did this in Germany. They did this in Germany. And at that time, I thought that this was a nutty thing to say, really extreme, really rhetorical, and I just disregarded it. But she kept saying, they did this in Germany. They did it in Germany. And she wasn't talking about the later years, National Socialist outcomes. She was talking about the early years, 1930, 1931, 1932, when Germany was a modern parliamentary democracy, a fragile one, but it would have been very recognizable to us. Germany in the early 30s had pop stars and Bauhaus architecture and Paris fashion and civil rights organizations, gay rights organizations, sex education organizations, Page Six writers, gossip columnists. And it was a democracy. And so she was talking about the very early pressures on a democracy, legal pressures on a democracy, by people who were intent on closing down that democracy. And I kept sort of brushing this off, but finally she sat me down and she gave me a stack of books and she almost physically said, read. And I started reading. And honestly, my hair stood on end because I saw that she was right. She wasn't being rhetorical at all. That in fact, not only were there tactical echoes from the past, but that what I was seeing was actual scenes recurring, imagery recurring, language, sound bites recurring in modern events in America. So then I began reading even more about how democracies close down, or how would-be despots crack down on the democracy movement. So I read about Italy in the 20s, and as always, Mussolini was the great innovator. He sort of pioneered this technology of closing down a modern democracy. I read about Germany in the 30s, as I mentioned, about Russia in the 30s, about East Germany in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, Pinochet's coup in Chile, and I read about the Chinese crackdown on the democracy movement at the end of the 80s. And what became completely clear to me is that every would-be despot, every would-be dictator, whether they're on the left or the right, does the same 10 things. There's a blueprint.
Fascist. People like to use the word to describe any politician they don't like, on both sides of the aisle. Now, it might seem like an exaggeration to call Trump a fascist. I mean, he's not calling for a genocide or imprisoning his own people without due process. But I want you to reflect for a moment on his words, on his political tactics, on his rhetoric, if you will. I've devoted the last decade of my life to studying fascist propaganda. And if you use history and philosophy as a guide, it's easy to see parallels between Trump's words and those of the most reviled fascists in history. That scares me, and it should scare you too. We've flirted with fascism before.
They wore Hitler's uniforms, but they wrapped themselves in the American flag.
But how are we seeing these images echoed in 21st century America? Well, the formula for fascism is surprisingly simple, and it gets repeated a lot. Italy and Germany, of course, but fascist movements are on the rise today in India, Myanmar, Hungary, Turkey, and right here in the United States. No matter where they come from, fascist politicians everywhere are cut from the same cloth. Fascism first takes root when politicians conjure up a faith in a mythic past, a past supposedly destroyed by liberals, feminists, and immigrants. For Mussolini, it was the Roman Empire. For Erdogan in Turkey, it's the Ottomans. Hungary's Viktor Orban rewrote the constitution with the goal of making Hungary great again. A line that sounded great to someone.
Did you ever hear this before? Make America great again.
Fascists create an overwhelming sense of nostalgia for a past that is racially pure, traditional, and patriarchal. From Mussolini to Hitler to Erdogan, fascist leaders position themselves as father figures and strong men.
I want to thank you for getting this country moving.
I can't thank you enough for the privilege that you've given me.
Greatest privilege of my life.
As long as he, and yes, it's always a he, remains in power, everything is possible. Without him, the whole system collapses.
I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor.
Once you've got your mythic past, you need the next ingredient, division. Whether it's between Germans and Jews, Hindus and Muslims, citizens and foreigners, whites and blacks, fascists succeed by turning groups against each other. The Nazis said Jews had no value because they supposedly did no mental or physical work. In Myanmar, the Rohingya have been denounced as rapists and criminals. A line which will sound familiar to many Mexicans.
They're bringing drugs, They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
When you divide, it's easier to control. Once fascism has taken root, it spreads through propaganda, and in particular, a kind of anti-intellectualism.
They can make anything bad because they are the fake, disgusting news.
Fascists attack the truth because truth is central to a free democracy.
It's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth.
Truth is truth. I don't mean to go like...
No, it isn't truth. Truth isn't truth.
With truth under attack and lies running wild, no one can agree on what's true anymore, and fascists love it when that happens. You might think I'm trying to frighten you by making these parallels. And do you know what? I am. My parents survived the Holocaust. And my grandmother, in her memoir, wrote about how Jews in Germany didn't see the Nazi threat until it was too late. In 1937, we were still able to leave the country, she wrote. We could still live in our homes. We could still worship in our temples. We were in a ghetto, but the majority of our people were still alive. I want you to be scared, because if you're not worried about encroaching fascism in America, before long, it will start to feel normal. And when that happens, we're all in trouble.
Soon after the election, there was this very, very strange incident at the annual meeting of the National Policy Institute, the NPI, and that's a very innocuous name for an organization that many people believe is sort of, if not, white, nationalist, very, very, far right. And at its head at the time was Richard Spencer. He's also the fellow who founded the alternative right and was a Trump supporter at the time, and so on and so on. Now, what was strange about this meeting was that at the beginning of it, Spencer, who's very excited about Trump's victory, sort of started the meeting by addressing the crowd and said, "Hail Trump, hail our hero, hail our victory. We made this happen. We dreamed Trump into the White House," or something along these lines. Now, the video from that meeting, that turned up on all the regular press around the world and all that. But there's a fellow named Harvey Bishop, who is a New Thought blogger. Now, New Thought is a name for a generic kind of philosophy called mental science, positive thinking. The most simple way to think of it is that thoughts are causative.
You can create your own reality.
We create our own reality. Thoughts are causative. We project out into the world the kind of reality that we want.
Which is kind of magic.
Yeah, it absolutely is magic. And we do this unconsciously. It's magic when you know you're doing it. And you can kind of do it at will, I guess. And so Bishop, who's writes about New Thought, all the stuff about we made this happen, we dreamed this into reality, that sounded a lot like the kind of things that people who practice mental science and New Thought do. Trump himself is a devotee of New Thought. He's a follower of Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking. He went to his sermons when he was a boy. He went there as a man.
Trump is using magic.
Well, I say whether he's using magic, but he certainly is a devotee of positive thinking. Positive thinking has its roots in New Thought. New Thought has its roots in 19th century occultism. Right. And that's one side of it. The other side is the chaos magic side, which I say in the book that he probably has never heard of it, but he seems to do it naturally. He seems to have a natural sort of talent for the ways in which chaos magicians are said to operate. This the glamour, creating chaos, moving in and out of realities, adopting truth and falsehood as just beliefs that you have temporarily and you dismiss them when you no longer do. But just the one thing that really sort of sold me on there being kind of a similar morphology, let's say, between New Thought, which generally seems kind of innocuous. I mean, Norman Vincent Peale, is very sober, conservative reverend. And the chaos magic tends to be a bit more wild and punky and dangerous. But they're both results driven. They're both very specific about, it's not about, a mystical experience. It's not about, finding your higher self. It's about having some effect in the real world. But in the long run, the idea was that somehow the people on the alt-right had used the internet as a way to propagate, memes, Richard Dawkins' term for this kind of cultural gene kind of thing. So that happens anyway without magic. But they were using one meme in particular, which was of this cartoon character known as Pepe the Frog, who was a very harmless amphibian who got drawn into this, as what they call the sigil. And the sigil is a kind of symbol or image that contains, magical powers, magical energies, the magician's intention, his will, and his imagination. And traditionally, you draw one, you make one, that kind of thing. But what's called meme magic is an offshoot of something called chaos magic. And you can understand chaos magic by thinking of it as something like found art. There's traditional art where the painter paints something and works on it.
So the idea that this becomes a focus for intention.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the internet becomes this kind of the realm in which the magic takes place. And long story short, how this became something that people were aware of was that people were posting all this stuff and they started to see these strange coincidences between what they were posting and stuff happening in the real world. And this got coined synchromysticism, which is a kind of techno update to Jung's notion of synchronicity, which is when there's something taking place in the inner world and something in the outer world, and they're absolutely connected in some indubitable, meaningful way, but there's no causal connection. There's no way that one or the other is linked in the usual ways, and that's why he calls it meaningful coincidence. So this meme magic, rather than have our traditional imagination inside our heads, you have the internet out there. So the internet is a kind of externalized imagination. And it makes sense because more and more our regular world is in this kind of strange interface between its representation electronically and the real world, and we want more and more our electronic representation of the world to be more lifelike, so everything's HD, everything's Blu-ray, whatever it is, more and more stuff like that. So again, as I said earlier, there's this kind of interchange going on between reality and its representation. So it makes sense in some way that stuff happening on the internet would find an echo out in the world. So that's kind of the theory behind it. And when people noticed that this was happening, they said, okay, well, can we make it happen on purpose?
I mean, you're not saying that one group of people got together and did it, but it was almost like self-generated?
Yeah. I mean, I'm assuming that some people started it, but then when you launch these things, they get picked up out there. And there was basically, I'm not saying every person who did it was consciously saying, okay, we're going to do this, but some people were.
Because certainly within the circles surrounding Trump, like Steve Bannon, for example, talks about Julius Evola, and
yes.
So there's certainly an awareness and affinity for the occult within that world.
That was the other thing that sent me thinking, like, yes, something.
Just for the people watching, who's Julius Evola and why is that significant?
If you know who Julius Evola is, you know that he was a 20th century esoteric thinker who had very far-right political views. He's brilliant, very controversial. He was called the dangerous author by the German novelist Hermann Hesse. And Evola tried to ingratiate himself first with Mussolini and then with the National Socialists. He had a bit of influence on Mussolini, but in the end he gave up on the Italians and he gave up on Mussolini because they weren't fascist enough for him. He had this vision of a kind of absolute fascism, this kind of theocratic kind of state. And then he tried to get his ideas across to people close to Hitler, but in the long run they didn't adopt him. And then after the war, he was this kind of shadowy figure in the background, the kind of the intellectual, providing material
about magic and
he does.
And...
Yeah, he does. I'm saying he talks precisely about the kind of using the mind to create reality. But I'm saying, and so he died again, like Gebser, he died in the early 70s.
So the idea, I mean, what we're saying is the idea of that this was consciously created by a certain number of people is not absurd, even knowing what we know.
I mean, it's not absurd. It's not inconceivable. I just say, like, I'm just sort of saying, I'm not saying they did this. I'm saying it looks like all this is possible, and everything is kind of lined up. And well, in the long run, yes, I do say it's not inconceivable because I personally accept the reality of synchronicities. I've had too many of them to dismiss them, and a few other sorts of things. And okay, and I would say my definition of magic is induced synchronicity. They happen. Can you make them happen? And I would say that's what the New Thought, that's what Chaos Magic tries to do. So that to me is the crux. Not that they happen, they do happen. Can you make them happen? But no, Evola, as I said, up until his death in the 70s after World War II, he was this kind of intellectual figure, doing the philosophy for a variety of different far-right groups that were rising up out of the rubble. But in the 20s, he contributed a series of articles to Esoteric Journal, and they're all about being able to focus the mind intently on your goal, and he talks about the absolute individual. And again, it's this idea that at some fundamental level of our being, before you are you, your personality, and you do what you do, you live where you live, it's some very, very basic bedrock level of being. It's the general mystical idea that we are the ultimate reality already. We don't know it, we've forgotten it. But if you can get down to that level, then you can narrow and focus your intent enough to be able to affect reality. But he talked about, rather than civilizations or history being this linear thing, with one civilization growing on top of the other, they're all self-enclosed, and they have their own values. So that there's not one mathematics, there's, Persian mathematics, and he talks about this Faustian culture. In any case, that's the idea. And again, that's very much along the lines, not only in the right, not only a sort of thing Dugin's interested, but also in the left. The whole idea that, there isn't one oppressive truth, there's lots of different truths, anything goes, and it's all socially constructed. Well, that's just trickle-down Spengler. Because Spengler is saying, there isn't one. Civilizations are like flowers. They're in the same garden, but they're not the same flower, and they're not all working to get to one big flower at the end. Each one grows, matures, blooms, and dies.
What impact did it have on you, or how exciting was it to discover that this stuff that you've been interested in for so long was suddenly showing up in all of these crazy ways, facilitated by the internet as this kind of, I've thought for a while the internet is kind of it's by democratizing information, it's kind of allowing all of this stuff to bubble up from the cracks in our culture, and in a way that would make perfect sense why magic, the occult, positive thinking is now coming up and is changing politics and changing culture at the sort of highest levels.
Yes. Well, it's exciting. I said I woke up when I saw that the New York Times had name-checked Julius Evola. I thought, well, things have changed now. The New York Times first place to mention Julius Evola was something, but then for them to mention it in the context of, at the time, someone who was a close advisor to Trump giving a talk to people in the Vatican, and then even within that, the context where he refers to Evola is in reference to Putin and in reference to this fellow Dugin who's around Putin. I just felt, wow, all the stuff that's on the fringe and on the margins has come into the center. And that, again, confirmed for me the idea that reality had changed, something had changed. Again, it's not, we still have three dimensions, there's still the past, present, and future, but how we understand these things, how we understand what it means to be human, how we understand freedom, all these very important things, how we even communicate. It's very difficult to talk about things. One of the things in this article I wrote about Peterson was that, and I say it in the book, is that you had this strange thing happening where, liberal left students were shouting down professors or people giving a talk or lecture, and they were saying things they didn't like. Okay, you can disagree, that's fine. But what is the difference between you shouting professors down now and Nazi youth shouting down Jewish professors in the 30s? Because yes, by all means, students can protest, but all student protests aren't about sweetness and light. God, if you go back even earlier, the university students in Germany in the 19th century were incredibly nationalist. And so their protests were all about nationalism. They were burning foreign books and things like that. So it struck me, as I said, it's exciting, but then at the same time, I don't know if people are prepared to actually understand what it means. I worked really hard at trying to communicate these esoteric hermetic ideas in a language, in a context that you don't have to agree with them, but at least they make sense. And I can show that they're not that far away from many concerns of the mainstream philosophical tradition.
Is it exciting or terrifying?
Well, it's that thing that's both. You're sort of on the edge, and there's no guarantee where it's going to go. And that's what all these people say. It's up to you. It's not an automatic process. It isn't the class war, like, oh, the march of history will just, if you just let history do itself, it'll take the line of least resistance.
So if you don't like what's happening, will you have to use magic yourself to kind of try and change it?
I think at all times it's very good to be aware of what's going on inside your head. I think that's the key. And if you don't have things going on there, then other things will be in there. Because I said, what happens in the mind doesn't necessarily always stay there, but what happens in somebody else's mind might wind up inside yours too. So the whole idea of wakefulness, attention, all these things which have a kind of cliche, banal character to them now, but they're actually, they're real. And again, it doesn't mean shouting down Trump or doing anti-Trump stuff or something. It just means being very, very aware and awake. Because I think in these times when it is sensitivity to initial conditions. A little thing can make something happen.
So are we back in the time of magic?
I don't think we ever left it. If reality's up for grabs, then get your skates on. Because if you're not going to do it, then other people are going to. And you'll be stuck with the reality that's there. And again, I don't mean sitting at home and visualizing your reality. Just being aware that these things work. Consciousness is something that's, it's not just there. It's not like ring-fenced and protected. It's part of a continuum of other things. And things can get in without you even consciously knowing it. I mean, this is one of the things Gebser felt when in Germany in the 20s, because he was around some of the early Nazi rallies. And this is why he talks about those group rallies precisely as an expression of the magical structure of consciousness. And one of the characteristics of that is this kind of continuum, a visceral continuum. It's not rational. It operates below the rational line. And he talks about how when he went to these rallies, even though he resisted it, he could feel the kind of energy, whatever you want to call it, coming into him. And not only occultists, but people in science, people like Rupert Sheldrake and people like that. They talk about something that's along those lines. So I think these things are true, and I think we just need to we need to stay awake, basically.
To really know life, you've got to be part of life. You must get down and look. You must get into the nooks and crannies of existence. You have to rub elbows with all kinds and types of men before you can finally establish what he is. I have studied 21 different primitive races, including the white race.
One of the things that predators do is study the targeted prey that is being hunted. Prior to ensnaring or capturing the targeted prey, the predator must have a trap that is very enticing.
It was that heady mix of emotion and belief, and you get stuck to it. It's so strong that it sticks you like glue.
It's the American way. It's a land of milk and honey, that if you're just smart enough and motivated enough, you can achieve whatever you put your heart and mind to.
Scientology really is a journey into the mind of L. Ron Hubbard. And the further you get into it, the more like L. Ron Hubbard you become.
You take on a kind of a matrix of thought that is not your own.
At all times, it's very good to be aware of what's going on inside your head. I think that's the key. And if you don't have things going on there, then other things will be in there. What happens in somebody else's mind might wind up inside yours.
The older person is a mentor of mine who is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And we would sit around chatting about news events. And she kept saying, they did this in Germany. They did this in Germany. And at that time, I thought that this was a nutty thing to say. So she was talking about the very early pressures on a democracy, legal pressures on a democracy, by people who were intent on closing down that democracy. And I kept sort of brushing this off, but finally she sat me down and she gave me a stack of books and she almost physically said, read. And I started reading. And honestly, my hair stood on end because I saw that she was right. She wasn't being rhetorical at all. That in fact, not only were there tactical echoes from the past, but that what I was seeing was actual scenes recurring, imagery recurring, language, sound bites recurring in modern events in America.
They wore Hitler's uniforms, but they wrapped themselves in the American flag.
These images echoed in 21st century America. Well, the formula for fascism is surprisingly simple, and it gets repeated a lot.
So then I began reading even more about how democracies close down, or how would-be despots crack down on the democracy movement. And what became completely clear to me is that every would-be despot, every would-be dictator, whether they're on the left or the right, does the same 10 things. There's a blueprint.
Fascist leaders position themselves as father figures and strong men.
They can't get what they want if the world knows who they really are.
I want to thank you for getting this country moving.
I can't thank you enough for the privilege that you've given me.
Greatest privilege of my life.
I want to tell you something. That I have never met a more competent, a more intelligent, a more tolerant, a more compassionate being outside of what I've experienced from LRH. And I've met the leaders of leaders. Okay? I've met them all. So I say to you, Sir COB, we are lucky to have you, and thank you very much.
He degenerated into a really paranoid, terrifying person.
You were in such a mental state that you're very controllable, very suggestible. We were told we needed to come up with what each other's crimes were against Miscavige and Hubbard so that we could eventually get out of the hole.
Scientology is really good at making you think that you're a scoundrel.
Confess your crimes, confess your crimes. What have you done?
Fights would break out. Miscavige would get me all riled up, and I remember one time Mike had done something or not done something, I don't remember, and I was supposed to go beat him up.
One executive was made to mop up the bathroom floor with his tongue. Another was put into a bucket and pummeled by some of the women and called a lesbian.
There was a very powerful air conditioner which blew straight down, and it was set on maximum cold, and a guy was made to sit in a chair and had water poured on his head until he literally turned blue.
Miscavige slapped me across the face, knocked me on the ground, kicked me a couple times.
Flailing fists, kneeing him in the stomach, getting him on the floor.
And you think you want to get up and retaliate. But you also think, I got 75 other people who are all likely to tackle me if I did. And then you get the sheer shock of it. Here's the equivalent of the Pope suddenly knocking you on the ground, and you're thinking, I must have really screwed up.
They were breaking into offices, framing people. This is the activities of a church?
There was a guy who, was a reporter for the LA Times whose dog was poisoned while he was working on a Scientology story.
Again and again, while reporting this story, we met many former members who described Scientology as a dangerous and deeply paranoid organization.
They hire private detectives to harass people. I have been sued twice. Financial ruin.
Years of harassment.
Their homes broken into, have them beaten.
We chased her around, we followed her to the airport.
Gotten hold of personal phone records.
Slash their tires, break their car windows.
I was locked in a chicken wire cage.
Dangerous, horrifying, terrifying fraud. A nightmare.
The codependent that finally breaks off a relationship with a narcissist needs to be in therapy. Needs to understand the psychological forces, the magnetic draw that the narcissists have over their life. There has been, or there is, a covert narcissist in your life. They are the worst type of narcissist, the absolute worst. Think about it. Covert narcissists thrive by pretending to be something they are not. Altruistic, kind, empathetic, connected. They pretend to be codependents. And as I explained, in detail in my YouTube video on covert narcissism. They get what they need out of life by creating this false self, this facade that gets them the money, the respect, but all at the same time, they're in these relationships where they're hurting people and behaving pathologically narcissistic behind the scenes.
And this gradual disintegration is the narcissist's futile effort, both to escape his predicament, the lack of narcissistic supply, and to sublimate his aggressive urges. His whole behavior seems constrained, artificial, and effortful. The narcissist gradually turns more and more mechanical, robotic, detached, and unreal.
So, the film Blade Runner, which is like the Philip K. Dick book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? In order to find the androids that live among us, because we created, in this dystopian reality, we created androids, replicants, they're called replicants, to do the jobs that humans don't want to do, but we made them too well. And the slogan of the company that produces the androids is more human than human, so it's really hard to tell if they're human or not.
We are making such individuals, and we're making them regularly, and we're making them routinely.
And I went, they said, so, like, have you met an SP?
You take on a kind of a matrix of thought.
One day it'll be like that. You know what I'm saying? Maybe
is not your own.
It will be wow, SPs, like they'll just read about those in the history books.
Because certainly within the circles surrounding Trump, like Steve Bannon, for example, talks about Julius Evola, and So there's certainly an awareness and affinity for the occult.
He was this kind of fat, shadowy figure in the background. This is one of the things Gebser felt when in Germany in the 20s, because he was around some of the early Nazi rallies, and this is why he talks about those group rallies precisely as an expression of the magical structure of consciousness. And one of the characteristics of that is this kind of continuum, a visceral continuum. It's not rational. It operates below the rational line. And he talks about how when he went to these rallies, even though he resisted it, he could feel the kind of energy, whatever you want to call it, coming into him.
It's a very difficult message. In some ways, I'm going to take you on a difficult journey, but I want to reassure you that we're going to come out to sunshine and hope